Here's a guy who thinks the problem of evil has been solved.
Do you think the existence of evil currently provides any very strong argument against the existence of God?
Well, that depends on how essential being all-loving or all-powerful is to the definition of God. If God is not all-powerful or not all-loving or neither, then it's not a very strong argument at all.
For over 2,000 years, the skeptic has relied on something called the Epicurean paradox, a trilemma. It tries to pit God's attributes of omnipotence and omnibenevolence against the existence of evil. It basically says that if God is willing to prevent evil but is unable to, then he's not powerful. And if he's able to prevent evil but he's simply unwilling to, then he's not good. It looks like a flawless checkmate, but before we break down exactly how contemporary logic dismantled this argument, you need to understand that the academic debate is largely already over. William Rowe is arguably the greatest atheist philosopher of religion of the 20th century, and he's already famously conceded this point, and he's not the only one. Here's his quote. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. There is a fairly compelling argument for the view that the existence of evil is logically consistent with the existence of the theistic God.
I guess by theistic God, he means a God that's defined in such a way as to be able to get around this obvious contradiction.
And like I said, he's not alone. The consensus on the atheistic side of philosophers of religion have all conceded that the logical problem of evil is no longer a problem. So if the heaviest hitters on the atheist side admit that the logical problem of evil is dead, well, what killed it? Let's look at the formal logic. Epicurus' argument makes a fatal assumption. It assumes that omnipotence means being able to do literally anything.
Oh, I see. So being able to do literally anything isn't a true definition of omnipotence.
But that's not how classical theism has ever defined omnipotence. We go all the way back to Thomas Aquinas. He argued that anything that implies a logical contradiction doesn't fall under God's omnipotence.
I'm willing to grant that an inability to do inherently incoherent things shouldn't count against omnipotence because they don't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything to make 2 + 2 = 7, so I wouldn't say that an omnipotent being should be able to do that. However, I think you're arbitrarily limiting omnipotence if there are things that are incidentally incoherent for that being to do. For example, if a being is perfectly good, and therefore it would be contradictory for such a being to do anything evil, then that perfect goodness makes it impossible for that being to be omnipotent.
Well, why? Because a logical contradiction isn't just something that's hard to do, it's a non-entity. C.S. Lewis summarized this perfectly a few years later. Nonsense doesn't become sense just because you put the words "God can" in front of it. Can God create a squared circle? No, not because it's a limit on God's strength, but it's because it's a meaningless contradiction. It's like asking if God can create a married bachelor, or asking if God can make humility taller than the Eiffel Tower. It's just stringing words together that are nonsense. God's inability to perform a logical or metaphysical contradiction isn't a limit on God's power, it's a limit on the coherence of the request.
Yeah, but only if it's inherently contradictory. If it is only incidentally contradictory, it makes perfect sense as a limit on God's omnipotence.
So Epicurus' entire trap falls apart if the solution he's demanding requires God to perform some logical absurdity. We shouldn't be asking if God can magically wipe out all evil. Instead, we need to ask if the atheist's ideal world, a world that contains genuine human freedom, yet where humans are completely incapable of doing anything wrong, is really just a squared circle in disguise.
It's not. If God has free will and can avoid ever doing anything evil, then why can't he make humans to both have free will and never do anything evil? If God can't do evil because he's perfectly good, then he's not omnipotent because doing evil is not inherently contradictory. I think it's pretty silly to say that God is omnipotent if there are things that I can do that he cannot. Also, if it is not possible for us to have freedom without ever doing anything evil, why would we want freedom? Why would having freedom be better than being morally infallible?
This brings us to exactly how a contemporary philosopher formalized what ancient philosophers have been saying for centuries. Now, ancient thinkers like St. Augustine pointed out the crucial role of human freedom when discussing the origin of corruption, but they weren't really trying to win a contemporary debate against atheists. They were doing more theology, at least with respect to this particular point. It wasn't until the 20th century when Alvin Plantinga translated that intuition to a rigorous contemporary analytical framework. And this modern logical formulation completely blocks the skeptic's deduction. Plantinga demonstrated that you can't force a free creature to always choose the good consistently every time.
God allegedly does good all the time. Is he not free? If he's not free, then it makes no sense to say that he's all-powerful, even if you disqualify incoherent abilities.
If God desires a universe with genuine uncoerced love, then he must grant genuine true freedom to his creatures.
If you cause someone to fall in love with you because you're irresistibly lovable, why would that not be real love? What would be the alternative? Loving someone for no reason? How is that real love? If the love you feel for someone is free instead of the result of a determining cause, that seems less real to me.
If you force love, it's not love. It's like trying to be a married bachelor. This goes for all moral actions. If I put a microchip in your brain, for example, forcing you to be nice to me, it's not you loving me. It's not you actually doing anything genuinely good because you're not the one doing it. You're just a meat robot executing your code.
And if you do good things not because your code is good, but rather for no reason, how does that make you good? I would say that a meat robot executing good code is better than a meat puppet controlled by a ghost who does good things for no reason. I suppose one might object that having free will doesn't mean that you do things for no reason, but what does free will mean if it doesn't mean that one's actions have no determining cause?
The problem is, if you think it's a problem, to create creatures capable of genuine love and genuine moral good, God must create creatures capable of moral evil.
Why doesn't that principle apply to God? Is God capable of moral evil? If he is, but just never commits it, why couldn't he have created us to be capable of moral evil, but just never commit it? If he's not, then wouldn't that mean that God is not capable of genuine love and genuine moral good?
Because again, God can't force a free creature to do the good consistently every time.
Does God not do good things consistently every time? Does he not have free will? If he does have free will and practices perfect abstinence from evil, why can't he create humans who also have free will and practice perfect abstinence from evil? If he doesn't have free will, then why should I want it? If not having free will is good enough for God, shouldn't it be good enough for me?
Remember what we said about what omnipotence actually entails. A world full of creatures who is significantly truly free, that is, able to perform good and evil actions, is, Plantinga argue, more valuable than a world full of meat robots who only do what's right because they're determined to do so.
Why would a world full of meat puppets that only do what's right for no reason whatsoever be better than that? When I do good things, it's because my conscience causes me to. My conscience, which is the product of the way my brain is wired and the way my experiences have programmed it, causes me to do good things. If I did good things not because my conscience makes me, but just spontaneously, independent of any prior determining reason, why would that be more authentically moral?
So the moral evil we experience is generated by free agents, not the creator.
So God is not responsible for creating these free agents who do evil? He's like the opposite of Harry Truman. I guess he has a little placard on his desk that says, "The buck stops down there."
The logic holds up perfectly.
Except for all the holes I just poked in it.
God and evil are not logically inconsistent.
Except for all of the inconsistencies I just pointed out.
Notice I said moral evil. This refers to things like harms inflicted by one person onto another. It doesn't account for natural evil, things like earthquakes and hurricanes, or metaphysical evil like finitude and limitation. That one I discussed in my last video. Go check it out.
How are those metaphysical? Those sound like attributes that physical things can have.
Plantinga's free will defense works only against moral evils, and as the record shows, the consensus among atheist philosophers is that it soundly defeats the Epicurean paradox that we thought was so unassailable.
So far, you haven't presented very formidable assailants.
But let's be brutally honest for a second. Winning a philosophical debate does not help you when you're sitting in an oncology ward. Maybe human free will explains war and murder, but what about those things that have nothing to do with human free choices? What about tsunamis or bone cancer? Why does God allow those kinds of evils?
If you read the Old Testament, you can see him do more than merely allow them.
This is where we leave the purely logical defense handled by Plantinga, and we deal with what philosopher Stephen Dijkstra calls the epistemological problem. The skeptic will say God should be healing cancer and preventing tsunamis at all times, and if he doesn't, he's evil. But notice how this presupposes another deeper claim. Because we can't see any good reason for these things, then probably a reason doesn't exist.
If God is all-powerful, then a justifying reason can't coherently exist. In order for allowing these things to be justified, it's not enough that they have consequences that are so good that they make up for the suffering they cause. It also has to be the case that the supposedly all-powerful God does not have the power to achieve those consequences without allowing the suffering. Even if allowing the suffering has results that are so good that they make up for it, that suffering is still not worthwhile if the same end can be achieved without it. Maybe you would argue that the ends God has in mind are not logically possible without the suffering, but the only good things that are logically impossible without suffering are never worth the suffering. For example, you can't experience the good of healing if you never get injured. I'd happily never experience the good of healing if that was the price of never being injured in the first place.
Dijkstra calls this the no-see-em argument. The general idea driving these no-see-em arguments is that we no-see them? Well, they ain't there.
That's not my argument. I don't claim that suffering can have no consequences good enough to make up for it. My argument is that an all-powerful God would have the power to achieve any end without allowing suffering, except for the ends which logically require suffering, which never justify it. I'd rather never be injured than experience healing. I'd rather nobody ever wrong me than experience forgiveness, etc.
From the claim that we no-see an outweighing good, one infers that no such outweighing good exists, and thus God doesn't exist.
My argument is that an outweighing good doesn't justify the bad if that outweighing good can be achieved without allowing the bad.
But think about how mistaken this thinking is. Not only does it confuse metaphysics, whether there is such a thing, with epistemology, what I can know about that thing, whether there are aliens, or whether I can know that there are aliens, for example.
I don't know of any Christian who behaves in a way that would be consistent with the idea that there must be some outweighing good to every bad thing that happens to them. The worse something is that happens to them, the happier they should be about it. How many Christians see their whole family get unalived and then say, "Oh man, there must be something mighty sweet that I'm going to get out of this"?
But also, this is Dijkstra's point, think about a baby getting a vaccine. All they register is trauma and pain. They have no ability to comprehend the greater goods of immunology and disease prevention. Now, the gap between an infinite, omniscient God and a finite human mind is infinitely larger than the gap between a parent and a child.
If human doctors were all-powerful and could prevent disease without giving a baby a needle, then giving that injection anyway would just be sadistic, wouldn't it?
Just because we no-see him, just because we don't immediately grasp God's reasons, does not automatically mean he lacks reasons.
It's not enough to have reasons. No matter how good his ends are, they don't justify suffering unless the supposedly all-powerful God lacks the power to achieve those ends without allowing the suffering.
This actually puts the skeptical argument in a fascinatingly awkward position.
It clearly doesn't.
To confidently claim that God has no overriding reasons for allowing a particular tragedy, one would need to literally possess omniscience themselves.
You don't need to be omniscient to understand that an all-powerful God would have the power to achieve any coherent end without allowing suffering. That's what all-powerful means.
They would need a God's eye view of all cosmic history just to prove their point. And because none of us have that vantage point, the logical objection stops dead in its tracks.
It doesn't if you understand that nothing could coherently justify accomplishing an end by allowing suffering, if that end could be just as easily accomplished without allowing suffering.
Now, contemporary philosophy does offer some brilliant possibilities, some candidates for what might be those overriding reasons. We have soul-making theodicies.
Soul-making theodicy says that God intentionally made humans fallible so that we can have the opportunity to develop character. This is analogous to injuries occurring so we can experience the good of healing. I'd rather not be injured in the first place than experience healing, and I'd rather not be imperfect in the first place than experience spiritual growth.
We have the absolute necessity of natural laws.
Were natural laws necessary prior to the fall, when everyone lived a suffering-free existence in the Garden of Eden? And why would natural laws be absolutely necessary to a supernatural being, especially an all-powerful one?
We have the contrast defense and a few others.
The contrast defense says that goodness wouldn't feel as great if there were no suffering to contrast it with. This, however, is a quirk of human psychology that God didn't have to subject us to in the first place. Does God himself need to suffer in order to fully appreciate goodness? Does this all-powerful God not have the power to fully appreciate goodness without suffering?
Drop a comment down below if you want a full video of me breaking down any one of these specific theories. But here's the crucial takeaway. Even if every single one of those candidate theories fails, then Dijkstra's core epistemological point remains standing. Just because we no-see God's reason in no way proves logically that they're not there.
If he's all-powerful, then there cannot logically be a reason that justifies allowing suffering.
Let's be real, this doesn't numb the pain. Philosophy protects the intellect, but grieving is still an absolute human necessity.
It wouldn't be if God had created us incapable of suffering.
Acknowledging our limited vantage point doesn't magically make the suffering disappear. But what it does do is keep us from demanding that an infinite intellect must strictly conform to our very finite human understanding.
How is this different from saying God works in mysterious ways? It renders the assertion that God has good reasons non-falsifiable and therefore meaningless. If we can't tell what the good reasons are, God having good reasons is indistinguishable from God not having good reasons. There's no meaningful practical difference between God having good reasons that we aren't capable of knowing and God not having good reasons at all.
The atheist's ultimate weapon fails because it demands logical or metaphysical contradictions. They're essentially demanding a universe where actions have no consequences and love requires no freedom or choice.
How is it a logical or metaphysical contradiction to say that love is most meaningful when it's felt for a determining reason, rather than being a chance occurrence that happens for no reason?
And our demand for immediate answers, even to natural suffering, fails because we don't have the vantage point of God himself.
We don't need God's vantage point to understand that it is a contradiction to say that an all-powerful God does not have the power to achieve coherent ends without allowing suffering.
Once those logical barriers are removed, you're left to wrestle with the reality that your remaining objections to God are profoundly emotional, not strictly logical.
Mine is strictly logical.
Let's be honest, does surviving the logical trap make you feel any better? Probably not. Because blocking a philosophical deduction on a whiteboard doesn't do anything for the experience of real heartbreak and suffering that you feel in your everyday life. But this is the thing, skeptics aren't usually rejecting God or losing their faith over abstract syllogisms.
I did. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.